I sent the divorce letter to my wife's hotel room while she was waiting for her lover. When she opened the envelope, her fingers trembled, and the paper slipped from her hands as if it were burning. She remained motionless for a few seconds, then sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide, as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. The man on the other side of the room asked, what there was. She didn't respond. He just looked at the document as if he could change what was written on his own. Maybe she was hoping to wake up from that nightmare, maybe she was hoping the paper would disappear. But he was still there, tearing up the perfect world she had invented for herself. I asked what happened. His voice became harder. He knows, he finally stammered, his voice weak. The silence that followed seemed as heavy as the charged air in the room. He knows. Those two words destroyed whatever illusion was left. Betrayal was no longer a secret protected by the hotel walls. It was exposed. And she knew the consequences would come even though she couldn't imagine them yet. But I could. I had imagined every detail. I had written every word of that letter, choosing them as blades to cut through his false security. And now, as she tried to piece together what was left, I waited. Because her despair was just the beginning. I was no longer there to watch the confusion in his eyes or hear his hasty excuses. He didn't want to see her tears or smell his cheap perfume on the clothes she wore. I had seen enough. Now it was her turn to see. He knows what? Insisted the lover, impatiently. All. She stood up, pulling her hair back in an automatic gesture, as if she wanted to maintain control, but her voice betrayed her. It was broken. Did he see me? He sent this here, didn't he? The lover pointed to the letter. That means he's known long enough to plan this. Plan. Yes, I planned it. For weeks, I analyzed every word, every action. I prepared myself for that scene. And now, even without being there, I could imagine her perfectly. The anger in his eyes. The despair in hers. The suffocating silence that surrounded them. She picked up her cell phone, her hands still shaking, and tried to call me. When I didn't answer, she sent frantic messages. He asked me to come home. He asked me to talk. He asked me not to do anything that couldn't be undone. But some things cannot be undone. I spent years building that life. Years of believing in the idea that love was enough. That difficult times would be overcome. That the flaws would be corrected. But instead, I discovered that while I was struggling to support the marriage, she was struggling to keep it a secret. And the secret had a price. Her lover watched her as she typed frantic messages, then stood up. I don't want to be part of this. He started to dress quickly. You said everything was under control. And it was. No, I wasn't. Now he knows. And do you know what that means? It means you need to deal with this alone. Alone. She followed him to the door, holding his arm. You can't leave me like this. I've stayed too long. He left, slamming the door behind him. And in that moment, she finally realized what I had already known for weeks. She was not a victim. He wasn't innocent. She had chosen this. Choosing to lie, choosing to betray, choosing to destroy what we had. But what she didn't know, what she still didn't know, was that her choices were just starting to take their toll. Because I didn't end it with a letter. I didn't stop after exposing what she did. I wanted her to feel every piece of the ground break beneath her feet, just like I did. As she ran to meet me that night, I knew her mind was full of questions. She thought she knew who I was, but she no longer knew. And when she found me, desperate, begging for answers, all I did was look her in the eyes and say the only thing that could destroy her even more, this is just the beginning. She froze. What do you mean, the beginning? But I didn't respond. I let her feel the fear build, let her imagine everything that could come next. Because sometimes, silence says more than any words. And I knew that, in that silence, she was beginning to understand. Understanding what it meant to lose everything. But what she would never imagine, what she didn't even consider, was that the divorce letter was just the first act of a story she would never forget. I had spent weeks planning every detail. I knew exactly where it would hurt the most. And she knew that, in the end, she would be forced to face not just what she did, but what she became. The lover was gone. The marriage was over. But her fall was far from over. And while she was desperately trying to find me, while she was looking for answers and solutions, I had already taken the next step. I had already set in motion the twist that would change everything. Because love can end. But revenge, this, can last forever. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but they carry deep truths about how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and dreams. They reveal secrets, uncover lies and show the inevitable consequences of wrong choices. Get ready for an intense narrative, full of emotions, twists and moments that will hold your attention from beginning to end. This story is not for the faint of heart. Fasten your seatbelts, and enjoy listening. David always believed he had built the perfect life. At 38 years old, married to Laura for almost a decade, he felt that, in a way, he had fulfilled all expectations. The spacious house they shared had been renovated exactly as Laura had dreamed of, neutral tones, light curtains, and carefully chosen furniture, as if each piece was part of a larger story. She loved decoration and always looked for ways to make the space welcoming, and David, even though he didn't understand much about colors or styles, was keen to support her ideas. For him, every detail of that house told a little of the journey they had traveled together. The sofa where they watched series on the weekends, the table where they had dinner and talked about work or plans for the future, the garden that he had transformed into a little refuge for her reading moments. That life had been built with love and dedication, at least that was how David saw it. Laura was the type of woman who effortlessly attracted attention. He had an easy smile and eyes that seemed to light up any room. She worked as a marketing manager at a local company and was always surrounded by people, which made David proud of her. He liked watching how she communicated, how she had quick responses and how she knew how to deal with the most tense situations at work. He always thought that Laura was stronger and more prepared for the world than he was. David, on the other hand, had a more reserved profile. A lawyer by training, he preferred predictable routines and quiet moments. The balance between them worked well. While Laura enjoyed going out and meeting people, David felt comfortable on quieter nights, but never failed to accompany her to events and social gatherings. He did this because he knew how important he was to her and, in fact, because he liked to see her happy. In the early years of their marriage, they seemed inseparable. Spontaneous trips, romantic surprises and plans for the future kept them together. Even as responsibilities began to mount, David's work deadlines, Laura's travel to meetings and events, they found time for each other. Or at least that's what David thought. In recent months, however, something had changed. Little details started to pile up. Laura received and responded to messages quickly, almost always smiling at her cell phone screen. Frequent departures for last-minute meetings and excuses about tight deadlines. She had always been busy, but now she seemed distant, even when she was home. David tried to ignore it. After all couples went through phases like this, didn't they? He remembered his mother saying that marriage was full of ups and downs and that true love was seen in the ability to overcome difficult times. He believed it. Or wanted to believe. But the silences started to get longer. Laura's fleeting glances, her evasive answers, the nights when she seemed too distracted to talk. David felt a tightness in his chest whenever he tried to bring up these topics and she deflected it, saying she was tired or overwhelmed. One night, while Laura slept, David stood in the bedroom doorway, watching her. She seemed calm, but he knew something was wrong. He felt it in the small gestures, in the touches that seemed colder, in the way she avoided eye contact when he asked if something was bothering her. He didn't want to be the kind of man who distrusted his own wife. I didn't want to be controlling or jealous. This went against everything he believed about healthy relationships. But that feeling didn't go away. It was like a constant warning in his mind, a silent warning that something was about to fall apart. David started paying more attention. Not because I wanted to invade her privacy, but because I needed to find an explanation. Maybe she was having problems at work. Maybe he was dealing with something he couldn't share. He even considered that it could be something related to her health, but Laura had always been transparent with him about these issues. Doubt began to eat away at his peace. He remembered the first years of their marriage, how Laura held his hand as they walked on the beach during their vacation, how she looked at him as if he were the most important person in the world. Had he ceased to be? Had he somehow stopped being enough? David tried to rescue these moments. He prepared dinners, brought flowers for no apparent reason, planned a surprise trip for the weekend. Laura smiled and thanked him, but something in her eyes was still missing. One night, while they were drinking wine on the couch, he tried to broach the subject more directly. "Are you happy?" he asked, holding her hand. "Of course I am," she replied, squeezing his fingers. "Why wouldn't I be?" But the answer came too quickly. No pause, no space for reflection. And David knew, in that instant, that he was just fooling himself. He started to notice even more details. In the different perfumes that Laura wore when going out to meetings. Excessive care with appearance, even for informal meetings with colleagues. In messages deleted from your cell phone. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Laura continued to be the smiling and charismatic woman that everyone adored. To her friends, to her family, to her coworkers, she was the perfect wife. And perhaps that was what bothered David most. The idea that he was missing something that everyone still saw as perfect. But perfection was just a facade. And David was starting to see the cracks. He spent sleepless nights, trying to find explanations. Trying to justify her behavior. Trying to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that it was just a phase, that Laura still loved him the same way. But his heart knew. I knew that, behind the smiles and rehearsed words, there was something more. Something he couldn't yet see, but that was about to change everything. And it was in this doubt, in this mix of fear and hope, that David decided to stop ignoring the signs. He needed to know the truth. And once he knew, he would need to be prepared to face whatever came next. David spent the next few days trying to ignore the restlessness that seemed to be growing inside him. No matter how much she tried to push the thoughts away, the images of Laura laughing alone with her cell phone in her hands or rushing off to unexpected meetings kept coming back. He forced himself to trust her, but every new detail he noticed seemed to steal a piece of that trust. The couple's routine was no longer the same. Conversations at dinner became short and generic, filled with phrases like, "My day was busy," and "I'm tired." Laura avoided looking him in the eye for a long time, and David felt more and more like a stranger in his own house. He tried to convince himself that it was all a figment of his imagination, but the uncomfortable feeling of missing something continued to grow. One night, after yet another failed attempt to rekindle their connection, David lay awake on the couch, staring into space. The clock was almost midnight when he heard Laura go up the stairs and close the bedroom door. He stayed there for a while longer, his mind divided between seeking answers and running away from them. When he finally went up to his room, he found Laura sleeping with her back to him, as she had been doing for weeks. In the following days, he began to pay even more attention. He noticed how Laura spent more time on her cell phone, quickly turning off the screen whenever he approached. She noticed how she avoided physical contact, always making excuses about being tired or worried about work. And then there were the messages. David had never been the type of man to invade his wife's privacy, but that night something made him act differently. When Laura went to take a shower, she left her cell phone on the bedside table. David hesitated, his hands sweating. He knew that opening that device could change everything, but the doubt was suffocating him. With his heart racing, he picked up his cell phone. The screen lit up, and a new message notification appeared. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow. It was hard leaving you today." The name in the message was just a generic nickname. David felt his stomach drop. The air seemed to be lacking. He continued skimming the conversations, reading words that left no doubt. Kisses. Plans. Statements he never expected to see there. He heard the water in the shower turn off and returned his cell phone to the table, his fingers shaking. When Laura returned, smiling slightly, as if nothing had happened, David had to control himself from confronting her right there. "I needed more. I needed to understand where this had gone." Over the next few days, David pieced together the puzzle. He followed her schedule, observed the patterns, and eventually found what he was looking for. A reservation at a hotel. In her name. The afternoon it all happened, David left the office early. He already knew where he was going. On the way, he felt his chest tighten as if every beat of his heart threatened to suffocate him. He thought about Laura's words over the years, the promises, the vows exchanged. Everything now seemed empty. He parked on the opposite side of the hotel, where he could watch without being noticed. He waited, each minute weighing like an eternity. When he finally saw Laura walk through the doorway wearing a dress he didn't recognize, his doubts turned into certainties. He saw her stop in the lobby, take out her cell phone and send a message. A few minutes later, a man appeared. Tall, well-combed hair, a confident smile. He greeted her with a discreet kiss on the cheek and a quick touch on the waist. David felt his stomach sink. He stood there, watching as the two went up in the elevator. Anger mixed with shock made him remain motionless for a few moments. And then he decided to act. With shaking hands, he quickly wrote the words that would change everything. It was direct, cold and calculated. He folded the paper, put it in an envelope and went to reception. He asked them to deliver it to the specified room, saying it was urgent. The receptionist didn't hesitate. As he walked back to the car, he felt his body shake. He didn't know what he expected to happen next, but something inside him already knew that this was just the first part of what was to come. Inside the room, Laura laughed at something the man said as he took off his shoes. But when he heard the knock on the door, his expression changed. She opened it and received the envelope. When he saw David's name in the sender, he felt his heart skip a beat. What it was? Asked the man, noticing his sudden change. She didn't respond right away. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers and began to read. With each word, his face turned pale. The air seemed to be lacking. What is written there? He insisted, approaching. Laura swallowed hard, but couldn't respond. The paper slipped from her hands, and she sank onto the bed, her gaze lost. The man picked up the document from the floor and read it quickly. His face also changed. Does he know? He asked, his voice full of tension. Laura just nodded, unable to form words. The silence in the room was almost deafening. The man hurriedly began to dress, but Laura grabbed his arm. You can't leave me like this. I can't stay here. He could be coming right now. Please. But he broke free from her grip and walked out the door without looking back. Laura sat there, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the sheets as if that could stop the world from collapsing around her. She took out her cell phone and called David. No response. Tried again. Nothing. Meanwhile, David was at home, sitting in the dark, holding his constantly vibrating cell phone. He knew that on the other end of the line, Laura was desperate. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. He left his cell phone on the table, got up and went to the bedroom, where there were still photos of the two of them smiling. He took one of them, looked at it for a few seconds and then put it back. The betrayal was exposed. But Laura still didn't know what was coming. Laura was standing at the door of the house, her eyes red and swollen. She had spent hours trying to reach David since that night at the hotel, but her calls and messages remained ignored. When he finally saw his car pulling into the garage, he felt relief mixed with fear. I didn't know what to expect. David got out of the car without rushing, keeping a cold and calculated look. He closed the door, walked towards it and stopped a few steps away. "We need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "Now do you want to talk?" He replied, crossing his arms. She tried to get closer, but he took a step back. "David, please. I can explain." "Explain what? How did you plan all of this? How did you manage to lie for so long? How did you manage to look me in the eye every night and pretend you loved me?" "It wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." He laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, full of pain. "You didn't mean to hurt me. Do you think this comforts me?" Laura grabbed his arm, but he pulled away. "I loved you, Laura. I gave you everything. I built this life with you, believing we were a team. And now," he stopped, taking a deep breath. "Now, this is all a lie." She cried, shaking her head. "It's not a lie. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But I still love you." "Love?" David threw the keys on the living room table. "You call that love? Because, for me, love is not betrayal." Laura fell onto the sofa, holding her face in her hands. "I was feeling alone. You were always busy, always worried about work. And I just wanted to feel wanted again. And you found this in another man's arms." He interrupted, his voice full of pain. "I was working for us, for this house, for this marriage." She was silent, unable to respond. "And the worst part," David approached. "It's just that you didn't just betray me. You underestimated me. He thought I would never find out, he thought he could hide it forever." Laura raised her head, her eyes shining with tears. "I was going to end everything with him. I had already decided. It was just a mistake, just a mistake." David laughed again, but this time there was something dark in his tone. "A mistake that lasted how long, Laura? Weeks? Months? And you want me to believe you would have stopped?" She tried to defend herself, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. "It's over, Laura. I don't want to hear any more excuses. I want the truth. The whole truth. Now." Laura took a deep breath. "I knew I couldn't hide anything anymore. I ended everything with him, but there's one more thing you need to know." David narrowed his eyes. "What?" She looked at him, as if trying to find the courage to say what was stuck in her throat. He asked me for money." David frowned. "Money?" "He knew I couldn't let this all end. You knew I was afraid of losing you, of losing everything. He said that if I didn't help him financially, he would tell you everything." David was silent for a few seconds, absorbing what he had just heard. "Did you give him money?" "I did. I was desperate. I just wanted to protect what we had." "Protect?" David took a step back, as if her words had hit him physically. "Protect by lying? Protect by hiding? I was scared." "Afraid of what, Laura? Of losing the comfort of this home? Of losing the image of a perfect wife? Or finally having to face the consequences of your choices?" She stood up, approaching him. "I regret it, David. I regretted it from the moment I realized what I had done." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control his anger. "And how much?" he asked finally. "What? How much did you give him?" Laura hesitated. 10,000. David took a step back. 10,000. I didn't know what to do. He threatened to expose everything. David ran his hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. And you thought paying would solve it? I thought he was going to disappear from my life. But he didn't disappear, did he? David stopped and looked directly into her eyes. He asked for more again, didn't he? She lowered her head. It returned. David felt a knot form in his stomach. And how much more? 20,000. His expression changed. Did you give him more money? She started to cry. I had to give it. I didn't know what he could do. David turned around, slamming his hands on the table. And you think this will stop? Do you think a man like him will just disappear? I don't know. She screamed, desperate. I don't know what to do anymore. David took a deep breath. I know. Laura looked at him, confused. What? He approached, speaking low and firmly. I already took care of that. Her eyes widened. What do you mean by that? David kept his gaze fixed. I found out who he is. I found out where he works, where he lives. And I did what had to be done. David, what did you do? I protected what was left of me. Laura fell to the floor, shaking. Does he know? David nodded. And now he's as desperate as you are. She put her hands over her face, unable to control her tears. You destroyed my life. David approached, looking directly at her. No, Laura. You destroyed it. I only exposed what was already broken. As she cried, David took the envelope with the evidence and left it on the table. Now you have two options, face this with me, or alone. Laura looked at the envelope, her face pale and her eyes wide. She knew there was no going back. Laura stood frozen in front of the envelope on the table. His fingers hesitated before touching it, as if the simple action of opening it could trigger something even more devastating. David watched her every move, his eyes steady but filled with a mixture of hurt and determination. What is that? Asked Laura, her voice almost a whisper. Open it, David replied, crossing his arms. She took a deep breath and pulled the flap off the envelope, dropping a set of photos and printouts of emails onto the table. His expression changed as he recognized the faces, the places. Each image was irrefutable proof. The lover. The meetings. The messages. Everything meticulously documented. My God, she covered her mouth with her hand. Did you follow me? I did what I needed to know the truth, David replied. And now you need to face her too. Why did you do that? He shouted, his voice breaking. To humiliate me? To destroy me? David approached, leaning over the table. No, Laura. To open your eyes. So you can see exactly what you did. And so that you understand that there is nothing left to hide. She stood up abruptly, her hands shaking. I made a mistake, David. I know that. But you don't understand how difficult it was. I was lost, alone, don't do that again. He interrupted, knocking on the table. Were you alone? I was here. I always have been. But instead of talking, of seeking help, you decided to betray me. And he still tried to cover it all up like I was an idiot. I loved you. Laura shouted, desperate. David laughed, but there was bitterness in his tone. Did you love it? Love doesn't do that, Laura. Love doesn't hide in hotel rooms. Love doesn't lie, doesn't manipulate, doesn't transfer money to a lover to keep secrets. She fell onto the couch, her knees giving out. I didn't know what else to do. I was afraid of losing you. You lost me the moment you made the first wrong choice. She stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Please, David. I can fix this. We can fix this. To repair. He took a step back, crossing his arms. Fix what, Laura? The trust? Respect? Or do you think 10 years of marriage can be erased with excuses? I would do anything. David was silent for a moment, studying her. Anything? She nodded quickly, wiping away her tears. Yes. Whatever it takes. He approached, bending down to her level. So tell me, Laura. Are you still hiding something? Her eyes wavered. I already told you everything, all. David narrowed his eyes. Because I think there is more. And you will tell me now. She looked away. Laura. I didn't want you to know. If you knew what? He pressed, his voice firm. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking. He threatened me. David was silent for a moment before sitting in the armchair across from her. How did you threaten? He said if I didn't keep paying, he would come to you. That would tell everything, but not only that. He said he would destroy my career. He said he would make me look like a thief, that he would make it look like I had stolen money from the company. David clenched his fists. And you believed it? I was terrified. He knew everything about me, David. I knew the hours, I knew where I worked, I knew who my friends were. He made it seem like I had no way out. You did. The truth. But he chose to continue feeding it. I just wanted to save time. She screamed, desperate. Time for what? So he can keep using you. For him to continue taking advantage of your weakness. She lowered her head, unable to respond. And now? David asked, crossing his arms. What do you think will happen now? I don't know. He stood up, pacing back and forth. I know. He will come back. He'll ask for more money. And if you don't, he'll follow through with the threats. I can talk to him, to speak. David stopped, looking at her. Do you really think he'll listen? Laura was silent, her face pale. That's what you don't understand, David continued. You're not dealing with someone who cares. You are dealing with a predator. And now he smells your fear. She started crying again. What do I do? You're not going to do anything. She looked at him, confused. What do you mean? David took out his cell phone, showing a message on the screen. I've already dealt with him. Laura's eyes widened. What did you do? I did what you should have done from the beginning. I went straight to him. David, no. I exposed everything. I showed that I knew who he was, what he was doing. And most importantly, I made it clear that if he tried anything against you or me, he would be finished. Did you threaten him? No. I gave him a choice. Get out of our lives, or face the consequences. And him? David took a deep breath. He chose to leave. At least for now. Laura collapsed onto the sofa, holding her head. My God, did you want an end, Laura? Here it is. But now comes the hardest part. She looked up. Which part? Move on. Separated. She swallowed hard. You can't be serious. I am. There are no more us, Laura. You destroyed it. But I love you. That's not love. She ran to him, holding his arms. I can change. I can do everything differently. He grabbed her hands, pulling them away. You had your chance, Laura. And wasted. She fell to her knees, begging. Please. David watched her for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. Goodbye, Laura. She called out to him once more, but he didn't look back. He just left, closing the door firmly. As her tears filled the floor, David walked away from that house, feeling the weight of her last words echoing in his mind. He knew that chapter was over. But what would come next, was something he would still have to face alone. David left the house, leaving behind the echo of Laura's sobs. He didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that if I did, I might hesitate. He needed to stay focused. The image of her lying on the ground, desperate, was still fresh in his mind, but he tried to push it away as he crossed the street towards his car. He sat in the driver's seat and stared at his hands for a moment. They trembled. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to set in, and the silence inside the car seemed deafening. He started the engine and left without knowing exactly where he was going. Just drove. The minutes turned into hours. The road ahead seemed a blur, but his mind was clear, filled with the fragments of that night. Laura's words echoed in her head. The excuses, the pleas, the empty promises. But what really tormented him weren't her words. It was doubt. Had he done the right thing? David always believed that right and wrong were as clear as black and white. He had built his life on these principles, on a commitment to honesty, on a dedication to marriage. But now everything seemed gray. He wondered if he had been fair, if he had given Laura the opportunity to redeem herself, or if he had been too merciless. He parked the car in an empty park. He stood there, in the dark, looking at the trees swaying in the wind. He tried to imagine the future, but everything seemed blurry. He took out his cell phone and saw several unread messages from Laura. Some were confused and begged him to come back. Others were longer, trying to justify what he had done. But the last one caught his attention. "David, I need to talk to you. Please. Just one more time. I swear I won't ask you for anything. I just need you to know something. Meet me tomorrow. I won't insist if you say no." He reread the message several times, feeling the weight of the words. What else could she have to say? Was there anything worse? Or was it just another attempt to make him reconsider? As much as he tried to ignore it, he knew he couldn't let this doubt eat away at him. The next morning, David drove to a small cafe outside of town, a discreet place that Laura had mentioned in the message. He arrived early, ordered a coffee and sat in a far corner. It didn't take long for Laura to enter. She was different. His eyes were tired, his dark circles were deep, and his expression was defeated. She approached slowly, as if expecting him to send her away before even sitting down. "Thank you for coming," she said, pulling out the chair. "Speak quickly," he replied, directly. She held the glass of water she had brought and fiddled with it nervously. "I thought a lot about what happened. In everything. I know you don't want to hear any more excuses, so I won't make any." "Excellent." She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on his. "But I needed to tell you something you don't know. Something that changes everything." He crossed his arms. "More secrets?" "It's not a secret, it's more of a burden. Laura, please, just listen to me." David took a deep breath and nodded. "After that night at the hotel, he came looking for me again. But it wasn't just about money. He wanted more. He wanted to destroy everything. He said that if I didn't give him more money, he would come after you. Not just to tell you everything, but to ruin you." David frowned. "Ruin me? As?" He knew about the sale of the company, about the money you were going to receive. He said he could create false evidence of embezzlement and involve you in a scandal. David was silent for a moment, trying to process this. "And you believed it?" He had contacts. Forged evidence. "I saw the documents. It was too compelling to ignore." "And what did you do?" Laura looked away. "I gave the money. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted to destroy me along with you." David felt his blood boil. "So you kept feeding it?" "I was desperate." He ran his hands over his face, trying to control his anger. Do you realize what you did? You put me in the path of this lunatic and even gave him the tools to destroy us. I didn't know what to do. Laura screamed, her eyes full of tears. David was silent for a moment, staring at her. And where is he now? It disappeared. After you confronted him, he disappeared. But I know he will come back. David closed his eyes for a moment. And if you come back, I'll be ready. Laura held his hand, but he pushed her away. I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I just needed you to know. I needed to get this out of me. He watched her for a moment, then stood up. I know what you needed. But that doesn't change anything. Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. David left the cafe without looking back. I knew that conversation hadn't closed the wounds, but at least it had ended the doubts. Now, he needed to move on, no matter how difficult it was. As he drove, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief at finally knowing the whole truth, but sadness at what I had lost in the process. Love, trust, dreams, all destroyed by wrong choices and poorly kept secrets. When he arrived home, he felt silence echo through the walls. He looked at the photos that were still scattered around the room, reminders of a past that now seemed distant. He picked one up, hesitated for a moment, and then put it in a drawer. He knew the journey was not over yet. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control. The moral dilemma he faced still haunted him. Should he have given Laura another chance? Could I have handled everything differently? But deep down, I knew the decision I had made was the right one. Now, he needed to look to the future and decide what he would do with the fragments of the past he still carried. David parked the car in front of the empty house. The darkness of the night seemed to match the emptiness he felt inside. The conversation with Laura still echoed in his mind, but, more than that, the weight of the silence after leaving the cafe seemed to scream inside him. He knew he had closed that chapter, but he also knew the scars weren't going away anytime soon. He opened the door and entered, feeling the still air of the place. The furniture remained in the same place, the photos were still scattered across the shelves, but the house no longer looked the same. He walked slowly to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the sink, staring at the distorted reflection in the window glass. As much as he tried to hold himself together, something inside him still struggled to process everything that had happened. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He looked at the screen and saw another message from Laura. She hadn't stopped trying to talk to him since their conversation at the cafe, but until then, he had ignored all her attempts. This time, however, something made him open the message. I know you don't want to talk to me anymore, but I need you to know that I resigned. I couldn't stand looking at people and feeling like they knew. I'm leaving town for a while. I need to breathe. I hope one day you can forgive me. David closed his eyes for a moment and then placed his cell phone on the table. She knew that decision was hers and, in a way, she felt relief. I needed space, distance, and maybe Laura needed it too. But there was a part of him that couldn't ignore the hole it left. The sound of the doorbell brought him out of his thoughts. He frowned, not expecting visitors at this time. He walked to the door and, when he opened it, he found a familiar face. It was Ethan, an old friend I hadn't seen in months. Dude, are you alive? Ethan asked, smiling, but soon noticed David's condition. What the hell happened? David stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Long story, he replied, closing the door. Do you want something to drink? I think you need it more than me, Ethan joked, but soon became serious. You look like you haven't slept in days. David went to the cupboard, took out a bottle of whiskey and poured 2 glasses. They sat in the living room, and, after a long silence, David finally began to speak. He told everything. From the first signs that something was wrong to the discovery at the hotel, the messages, the threats, and the confrontation. Ethan listened to everything without interrupting, but his expression changed with each detail. When David finished, Ethan let out a heavy sigh. "Man. I don't even know what to say." "Neither do I," David replied, taking a sip of his drink. "Do you think she was telling the truth about this guy? About him wanting to ruin you?" "I think. I saw it in her eyes. And even if it was a lie, the damage has already been done." Ethan shook his head. "And now? What are you going to do? Move on. At least try." Ethan was silent for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've always admired you and Laura. You guys looked so perfect." David laughed, but without humor. "We seemed. And you, still love her?" The question took David by surprise. He opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "Part of me wants to hate her. Part of me feels sorry. And another part. You still miss her," Ethan added. David nodded slowly. "But that doesn't change anything. Love is not enough when there is no trust." Ethan finished his glass and placed it on the table. "I think you need a fresh start. Something new. Someone new." David laughed lightly. "After all that? I don't think I'm ready. Maybe it never will be. But sometimes life doesn't wait for us to be ready." David stared at his friend for a moment and then looked away. "I just want to sleep." "Then start there. Tomorrow, you face the rest." Ethan said goodbye soon after, leaving David alone again. But this time, the silence seemed less suffocating. He went up to his room, lay down on the bed, and for the first time in weeks, he was able to sleep. In the days that followed, David tried to get back to his routine. He went back to work, threw himself into the cases he had accumulated, and began filling the void with appointments and deadlines. But even so, the past continued to haunt him. He never spoke to Laura again. I learned from mutual friends that she had indeed left town, and although my chest felt tight when I heard this, I also knew it was what was best for both of them. It was on one of these nights, when he was leaving the office late, that he met Emily. She worked in the building next door and was at the coffee shop he used to stop at. The two started talking by chance, and before he knew it, David was laughing again. Emily had a different energy, something light and spontaneous that contrasted with everything he had experienced in the last few months. They started hanging out without pretensions, but over time, David realized he was beginning to feel something new, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But Laura's shadow still loomed over him. Whenever he felt like he was moving forward, a memory or thought would pull him back. He knew he needed to end that cycle once and for all. That's why, after weeks of ignoring the urge, he finally decided to respond to Laura's last message. "I hope you are well. I moved on. I hope you can too." He sent it and felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. I knew that chapter was closed. When he met Emily that night for the first time, he felt like he was ready to start over. But the past still haunted him, and he knew he would need to face it once again before he could find peace. David closed the apartment door and let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. The room was lit only by the soft light from the lamp next to the sofa. He took off his shoes, placed his keys on the table, and stood still for a moment, feeling silence fill the space around him. There was a strange feeling of calm, as if, for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to fight his own thoughts. But the silence was also a reminder of the void Laura had left. Even after everything, he still found himself thinking about her sometimes, not about the woman who betrayed him, but about the person she had been before everything fell apart. The easy smile, the nights when they laughed for no reason, the plans for the future that seemed so right. Now, all of that was nothing more than distant memories. She sat on the sofa and took out her cell phone. He opened the last message he had sent to Laura, the one that ended the cycle between the two once and for all. There was no response. Maybe she knew there was nothing more to say. Or maybe I would have just moved on. Either way, David felt he no longer needed an answer. The days that followed brought a new routine. Emily became a constant but not suffocating presence. She knew when to give space, but she also knew how to fill empty moments with light conversation and spontaneous laughter. David felt comfortable around her, something he hadn't felt in a long time. But even so, there was something inside him that hesitated to give himself completely. It was on a rainy night, while they were having dinner in her small apartment, that Emily finally asked, "Do you think you're ready to start again?" David hesitated for a moment, fiddling with his fork. "I don't know," he replied, honestly. "I think part of me is still stuck in the past." She took his hand. "Then maybe you need to put this behind you once and for all." David knew she was right. And the next day, he decided he would do just that. He went to the house where he had lived with Laura. The sale was already underway, and the place would soon have new owners. But before that, he needed to face that space one last time. As he entered, he smelled the familiar smell that seemed to permeate the walls. He walked through the rooms, remembering each moment. The room where they used to spend hours talking. The room where they shared secrets and dreams. The kitchen where they fought over who left dishes in the sink. He stopped in the master bedroom and looked at the empty closet. It was there that he had found the first signs of betrayal. The smell of a perfume that wasn't his. The carefully folded clothes that looked out of place. Now everything seemed just a distant echo. Before leaving, he took the last box of personal belongings and locked the door for the last time. At that moment, he felt the weight lift off his shoulders. It was ready. Meanwhile, Laura was in another city, trying to rebuild her life. He rented a small apartment and got a new job, far from everything that reminded him of his old marriage. But guilt followed her like a shadow. She thought about David every day. I wondered if he had found someone, if he was happy, if he had managed to move on. But deep down, I knew I had lost him forever. And maybe he deserved it. The nights were the worst. That was when the silence became deafening and the memories came back with a vengeance. She wondered if she would ever be able to forgive herself, but for now, she just continued to survive. The lover, on the other hand, did not have such a discreet ending. After disappearing for a while, it reappeared when the financial situation began to tighten. He tried to contact Laura once again, but she ignored him. Then, he started harassing her, sending threatening messages. Desperate, Laura went to the police and presented all the evidence of harassment, including the old messages he had sent. The case was investigated, and he ended up being arrested for extortion and attempted fraud. David learned this weeks later, but felt no satisfaction. Just relief knowing that part of the past wouldn't come back to haunt him. He no longer cared what happened to the man. His concern now was just moving forward. And that's exactly what he did. In the following months, his relationship with Emily grew. They traveled together, met new people, and slowly David felt like he was really starting to live again. There were still times when the past would creep into his mind, but he learned to accept it as part of who he was. The scars would remain, but they no longer hurt. Laura continued trying to rebuild herself. He found a support group and began working voluntarily on social projects. He was trying to redeem himself, even if no one else knew the weight he was carrying. She knew she would never get back what she lost, but she also knew she needed to move on. Time passed. David and Emily decided to move in together, and for the first time, he felt at peace. Looking to the future, I felt like I had found a new beginning. In the end, they all paid the price for the choices they made. David lost his marriage, but found a new chance to be happy. Laura lost David's love and trust, but found the courage to face the consequences and try to start over. And the lover lost his freedom, paying the price for his manipulation and greed. Life moved on for all of them, but the scars of the past remained as reminders of the choices they made, and the inevitable consequences. And so ends this story of betrayal, lies and redemption. Now we want to know what you think. Leave your comments sharing your opinion on this intense story full of twists and turns. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Remember, the channel does not support any type of betrayal. This story is fictional and serves as a warning about how wrong choices can change lives forever. Thanks for following us and see you next time.